My wife posted an engagement photo with her assistant. I said yes. I commented, "Congrats," just tagging our divorce lawyer. The post vanished, but seconds later, she was frantically calling, begging me to retract the screenshots I sent her parents. I, 34M, discovered my wife's betrayal in the most humiliating way possible, through a Facebook post that made my blood turn to ice. There I was, scrolling through my feed during lunch break, when her beaming face filled my screen. She was wearing the white sundress I'd bought her for our anniversary last month, standing next to her assistant from the marketing firm where she worked. His arm was wrapped around her waist, both of them grinning like idiots, and there it was in bold letters. I said yes. The engagement ring on her finger wasn't the one I'd given her 8 years ago. This was bigger, flashier, the kind of ostentatious diamond that screamed new money. My hands started shaking as I read the caption about how surprised and happy she was, how she couldn't wait to start this new chapter of her life. I sat there in my car, engine still running, staring at the screen like it might change if I blinked hard enough. We'd had breakfast together that morning. She'd kissed me goodbye and told me she loved me, just like she had every day for the past 8 years. The coffee cup in my hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. My first instinct was to call her, to demand an explanation, to scream until my throat was raw. But something cold and calculating settled over me instead. I screenshotted the post from every possible angle, saved it to my phone, sent copies to my email, my cloud storage, everywhere I could think of. Then I did something that felt both perfectly reasonable and completely insane. I commented on the post. "Congrats. Just tagging our divorce lawyer at Johnson Legal Services. Thanks for making this easy." The notification that I'd tagged our family attorney's business page popped up immediately. I'd met him through a colleague 2 years ago when we'd needed help with our mortgage refinancing. He specialized in family law, and everyone at work knew it. I figured if she wanted to make our private business public, I could return the favor. Within 30 seconds, the post disappeared, vanished completely, as if it had never existed. But I had my screenshots, and more importantly, I'd already sent them to the people who mattered most. Her parents had always treated me like the son they never had. They'd welcomed me into their family from the moment we started dating, included me in every holiday, every family gathering, every major life event. They deserved to know what kind of person their daughter really was. I sent the screenshots to both of them separately, along with a simple message about how sorry I was that they had to find out this way, and that I hoped we could still maintain a relationship despite what their daughter had done. Then I sent copies to my own parents, my sister, and my brother-in-law who worked at the same company as her assistant. I wasn't being vindictive, I was being practical. If she was going to blindside me with a public announcement, I needed to control the narrative before she could spin it in her favor. My phone started buzzing almost immediately. The first call came exactly 97 seconds after I'd sent the screenshots. She was crying, her voice high and panicked, asking me what I thought I was doing and begging me to delete everything. She said it wasn't what it looked like, that it was complicated, that she could explain everything if I'd just give her a chance. I hung up. The second call came 2 minutes later. This time she was angry, accusing me of trying to ruin her life and demanding to know how I could be so cruel. She said I was embarrassing her at work, that people were already starting to ask questions, that I was being petty and vindictive. I hung up again. By the time the fifth call came through, her tune had changed completely. Now she was apologetic, promising it was all a mistake, that she'd been confused and overwhelmed, that she still loved me and wanted to work things out. She begged me to call her parents and tell them it was all a misunderstanding, that we were just going through a rough patch. I finally answered the sixth call. She was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. Between the tears and the hyperventilating, she managed to tell me that her parents had already called 3 times, that her mother was devastated, that her father was threatening to drive over and have a conversation with her assistant. Her boss had apparently seen my comment before the post was deleted and was now asking uncomfortable questions about workplace relationships. She wanted to know how I could destroy 8 years of marriage over one mistake, how I could be so heartless, how I could ruin her reputation and her career just because I was hurt. That's when something inside me snapped. I told her that I wasn't the one who destroyed our marriage. I wasn't the one who'd been sneaking around with a coworker for God knows how long. I wasn't the one who'd posted engagement photos on social media while my spouse was eating cereal and reading the morning news, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire life was about to implode. I told her that if she wanted to talk about Heartless, she could start by examining her own behavior. If she wanted to talk about reputation, she could think about what it meant to humiliate someone who'd loved her unconditionally for nearly a decade. Then I hung up and turned off my phone. The rest of that day passed in a strange, numb haze. I went back to work, finished my projects, attended my meetings, responded to emails, all while feeling like I was watching someone else's life unfold. My colleagues could sense something was wrong, but nobody asked questions. I was grateful for their professionalism. That evening, I drove to my brother's house instead of going home. I needed time to think, to process what had happened, to figure out what came next. He opened the door before I could knock, took one look at my face, and handed me a beer without saying a word. We sat on his back porch until well after midnight, not talking much, just existing in the same space while I tried to wrap my head around the fact that my wife, the woman I'd planned to grow old with, had been living a double life. My sister-in-law brought me a plate of leftover dinner and a pillow for the couch. She didn't ask questions either, just squeezed my shoulder and told me I could stay as long as I needed. I slept fitfully, waking up every hour or so with the sick feeling that comes from remembering something terrible all over again. By 6 a.m. I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering how many signs I'd missed, how long this had been going on, whether anything about our relationship had been real. When I finally turned my phone back on around 7, I had 43 missed calls, 37 text messages, and 12 voicemails. Most were from her, but several were from her parents, my parents, mutual friends who'd apparently heard about the situation through the grapevine. Her father had left a voicemail that made my chest tight. He apologized for his daughter's behavior, said he was ashamed and disappointed, and asked if I wanted to meet for coffee to talk things through. Her mother's message was shorter but equally devastating. She'd simply said she was sorry and that she loved me like her own son. My own parents had left messages offering support and asking if I needed anything. My sister wanted to know if she should cancel the birthday party we'd planned for next weekend. My best friend from college, who lived 3 states away, had somehow heard about everything and was offering to drive down immediately. The messages from her ranged from desperate pleading to angry accusations to promises that she'd do anything to fix this if I'd just talk to her. I deleted them all without reading most of them. Instead, I called the divorce attorney I'd tagged in my comment. It was barely 8 a.m., but I figured I could at least leave a voicemail and get the ball rolling. To my surprise, he answered on the second ring. He'd already heard about the situation. Apparently, my public tag had generated some buzz in local legal circles. He was compassionate but professional, explaining the process, the timeline, the things I needed to gather and prepare. He scheduled an appointment for that afternoon and recommended a therapist who specialized in betrayal trauma. By 9 a.m., I was showered, dressed, and heading back to my house to collect some essentials. I figured she'd be at work already, giving me a window to pack without confrontation. I was wrong. She was sitting at our kitchen table, still in the same clothes from yesterday, looking like she hadn't slept at all. Her eyes were red and swollen, her hair was a mess, and she looked smaller somehow, like she'd shrunken on herself overnight. She started talking the moment I walked in, words tumbling out in a rush about how sorry she was, how it had started innocently, how she'd never meant for it to go so far. She said she'd been confused, that her assistant had pursued her relentlessly, that she'd been feeling unappreciated and taken for granted in our marriage. She wanted to know if we could go to counseling, if we could work through this, if I could find it in my heart to forgive her. She promised she'd quit her job, cut off all contact with him, do whatever it took to rebuild my trust. I listened without interrupting, watching her face as she spoke, looking for any sign of the woman I'd thought I'd married. All I saw was someone trying desperately to avoid the consequences of her choices. When she finished, I told her I needed to pack some things. I walked past her to our bedroom, opened the closet, and started filling a suitcase with clothes and toiletries. She followed me, continuing to plead her case, reaching for my arm when I tried to move past her. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop even further. Our wedding photos were gone from the dresser. The framed picture from our honeymoon that had sat on my nightstand for 8 years was missing. Even the small framed photo of us from last Christmas had been removed. I asked her about it, and she broke down completely. She admitted she'd taken them down weeks ago because seeing them made her feel guilty. She'd hidden them in the spare bedroom closet because she couldn't bear to look at them anymore. That's when I realized this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a recent development. This had been going on for months, maybe longer. She'd been systematically erasing me from her life while I remained completely oblivious. I finished packing in silence while she cried on the bed we'd shared for 8 years. When I zipped up the suitcase, she asked me where I was going to stay, whether I'd call her later when she might see me again. I told her she'd be hearing from my attorney. The next few days blurred together in a haze of legal consultations, phone calls with family, and attempts to maintain some semblance of normalcy at work. Word had spread through our social circles with remarkable speed, and I found myself fielding well-meaning but exhausting conversations with friends who'd heard various versions of the story. Some people were outraged on my behalf. Others suggested I might be overreacting, that marriages went through rough patches, that maybe we could work things out if we tried hard enough. A few mutual friends seemed torn between loyalty to both of us, trying to remain neutral while clearly struggling with what they'd learned. The most surprising reaction came from her coworkers. Apparently, my public comment had created quite a stir at her office, and several people had reached out to me privately. I learned that the relationship with her assistant had been an open secret for months, that they'd been seen together at company events, that there had been whispers and speculation about whether something was going on. One of her former colleagues, someone I'd met at a few office parties over the years, sent me a long email explaining that she'd left the company recently partly because the situation had made the workplace uncomfortable. She'd witnessed several intimate conversations between them, had seen them leaving together after hours, and had felt conflicted about whether to say something. She apologized for not reaching out sooner and said she'd been worried about causing drama or getting involved in something that wasn't her business. Reading her message, I realized that probably dozens of people had known about the affair while I'd remained clueless, going about my daily routine like everything was normal. Update 1. 3 weeks later, the divorce proceedings were moving forward smoothly. My attorney was efficient and thorough, and because she'd essentially provided public evidence of infidelity, the legal aspects were fairly straightforward. We owned our house jointly, had some shared investments, and needed to divide our assets, but there were no children involved and no complicated financial entanglements. She tried to contact me several times through mutual friends, family members, and even showed up at my workplace once. Each time, I maintained my boundary that all communication needed to go through our attorneys. I wasn't being vindictive. I simply couldn't trust myself to have a rational conversation with her, and I didn't want to give her any opportunity to manipulate the situation. The most difficult part was dealing with the well-meaning people who kept suggesting that I was giving up too easily, that 8 years of marriage was worth fighting for, that everyone makes mistakes. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't just about infidelity. It was about the systematic deception, the public humiliation, and the complete lack of respect for our relationship. Her parents had reached out several times, and I'd maintained a cordial relationship with them while making it clear that reconciliation wasn't on the table. They seemed to understand and respect my decision, even though I could tell they were devastated by the whole situation. My own family had been incredibly supportive, offering practical help with the move and emotional support when I needed it. My brother had helped me find a decent apartment, and my sister had assisted with the logistics of separating our belongings. The strangest part of the whole experience was how quickly life started to feel normal again. I'd expected to be devastated, to spend months wallowing in depression and self-pity. Instead, I felt oddly liberated. The constant low-level anxiety I'd been carrying, which I now realized had been my subconscious picking up on signs that something was wrong, had completely disappeared. I'd started seeing the therapist my attorney recommended, and she'd helped me understand that my response hadn't been about revenge at all. It had been about taking back control of a situation where I'd been powerless and deceived. The public nature of her announcement had required a public response, and my comment had simply exposed the truth of our situation. Update 2. 2 months after the Facebook incident, I received an unexpected phone call from her assistant's wife. I hadn't even known he was married. She'd apparently discovered their affair around the same time as my dramatic revelation, and she wanted to thank me for making it impossible for them to continue their relationship in secret. Her husband had initially tried to deny everything, but my screenshots had provided undeniable evidence of what was happening. She told me that they'd been married for 12 years and had 3 children together. She'd suspected something was going on, but hadn't been able to prove it. When the Facebook post appeared and then disappeared so quickly, followed by my comment, everything had clicked into place for her. Her husband had apparently confessed to the affair after she confronted him with the evidence, and they were now in couples counseling trying to work things out. She said she understood why I'd chosen divorce instead, and she didn't judge me for it, but she felt she needed to try to save her marriage for the sake of their children. The conversation was surreal but oddly comforting. Here was someone who truly understood what I'd been through, who'd experienced the same betrayal and humiliation. We talked for nearly an hour, comparing notes about the signs we'd missed, the lies we'd been told, the ways our spouses had justified their behavior. She mentioned that her husband had been deeply embarrassed by the public nature of the exposure and had initially blamed me for ruining his reputation at work. But over time, he'd come to acknowledge that he'd created the situation himself through his choices. My ex-wife had apparently been devastated when the relationship ended. According to the assistant's wife, she'd expected him to leave his family for her, and when that didn't happen, she'd realized she'd destroyed her marriage for nothing. I felt a brief moment of sympathy for her, quickly followed by the reminder that she'd made her choices with full knowledge of the consequences. The fact that those consequences had turned out differently than she'd hoped didn't change the fundamental betrayal of our relationship. Update 3. 6 months later, the divorce was finalized. The proceedings had been remarkably civil, largely because the evidence was so clear-cut that there wasn't much room for argument. We'd split our assets fairly, sold the house, and moved on with our separate lives. I'd thrown myself into work and had recently been promoted to a senior management position. The increased responsibility and salary were welcome distractions, and I was finding genuine satisfaction in the challenges of my new role. I'd also started dating again, cautiously but optimistically. A colleague had introduced me to her sister, and we'd been seeing each other for about a month. She was kind, straightforward, and refreshingly honest about her intentions and feelings. The contrast with my previous relationship was stark and reassuring. My ex-wife had apparently left her job and moved to another city. According to mutual friends, she was struggling with depression and had been in therapy for several months. Part of me felt sorry for her, but I learned to recognize that sympathy as a remnant of old habits rather than a reason to reconsider my decisions. The assistant and his wife had managed to reconcile, though from what I'd heard, it had been a long and difficult process. They'd moved to a different neighborhood and were apparently doing better, though trust was still an ongoing issue. Looking back on the whole experience, I realized that my split-second decision to comment on that Facebook post had been one of the best choices I'd ever made. It had short-circuited what could have been months or years of lies, gaslighting, and manipulation. Instead of being slowly tortured by a relationship that was already over, I'd been able to make a clean break and start rebuilding immediately. The public nature of the exposure had been humiliating at first, but it had also made it impossible for anyone to misrepresent what had happened. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative narratives or blame shifting. The truth was documented and undeniable. More importantly, it had forced me to confront the reality of my situation immediately instead of allowing me to live in denial or false hope. The shock and pain had been intense but brief, like ripping off a bandage instead of peeling it away slowly. I still occasionally wondered what might have happened if I'd handled things differently, if I'd tried to work things out, if I'd been more forgiving or understanding. But those thoughts came less frequently now, and when they did, I reminded myself of how much better my life had become since I'd stopped trying to salvage something that was already broken. The woman I was dating now had asked me about my previous marriage, and I'd told her the story honestly, but without bitterness. She'd said she was impressed by how I'd handled the situation, that it showed character and self-respect. Her reaction had surprised me. I'd expected judgment or concern about my capacity for forgiveness. Instead, she'd said it demonstrated that I had clear boundaries and wouldn't tolerate being disrespected or deceived. She found that attractive rather than concerning, which had been a revelation about the kind of relationship I deserved. As I sat in my new apartment on a Sunday morning, drinking coffee and reading the news, I felt a deep sense of contentment that had been missing from my life for longer than I'd realized. The apartment was smaller than the house I'd shared with my ex-wife, but it felt more like home than anywhere I'd lived in years. My phone buzzed with a text from my current girlfriend, asking if I wanted to meet her family at a barbecue next weekend. A year ago, the idea of meeting someone's family would have felt routine, expected, just another step in the predictable progression of a long-term relationship. Now it felt like an adventure, a choice I was making freely rather than an obligation I was fulfilling. I typed back that I'd love to meet them, and I meant it completely. The contrast with my previous relationship was striking. Where once I'd felt trapped by expectations and routine, now I felt energized by possibilities. Where once I'd accepted deception and disrespect as normal relationship challenges, now I expected honesty and consideration as basic requirements. The Facebook post that had destroyed my marriage had also liberated me from a life that was slowly strangling my spirit. For that, despite everything that had happened, I was grateful. My ex-wife had taught me what I wouldn't tolerate. My new relationship was teaching me what I deserved. The difference was transformative, and for the first time in years, I was excited about the future instead of just enduring the present. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about hurting someone else. It's about refusing to let their actions define your life. By responding quickly and decisively to her betrayal, I'd taken control of my own narrative and started writing a better story. The screenshots I'd sent that day had documented the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Looking back, I wouldn't change a single thing about how I'd handled it. The truth, however painful, had set me free.